you see in her face, the mirror of your dream. Make believe I'm everywhere, hidden in the light. Written on the pages is the answer to a never-ending story. Reach the stars, fly a fantasy, dream a dream, and what you see will be rhymes that keep their secrets will unfold behind the clouds. There upon the rainbow is the answer to a never-ending
That keep their secrets will unfold behind the clouds. And there upon the rainbow is the answer to. You ever have one of those assignments in 7th grade English where you're supposed to describe what some word or phrase symbolizes in the story or book you're reading? You know, you're supposed to notice every time you see the word apple and then tell what it really means. With evidence, like it's some kind of scientific experiment or something.
Yeah.
I know. It makes me want to puke too. I mean, that's crazy, right? Like the author, every time they wrote the word apple, or orange for that matter, they had some mental dictionary. They hoped or expected that whenever you came across those words, you'd conjure up in your mind the Garden of Eden or something like that. I had some other feelings too, though. I mean, maybe there was some key to apple that I just didn't get yet. So I felt kind of dumb. I mean, they wouldn't give me the assignment for nothing, would they? Would they? I puzzled over this. I was conflicted. I struggled with it on into my adulthood when in odd moments I'd be walking home from work, talking to a friend, stepping out of a bookshop, and I'd wonder, could there really have been something to those assignments? Or were they a colossal waste of time? Well, for a while I went with the colossal waste of time theory. And then I met Charles Dickens. I mean, he wasn't walking the streets of Berkeley or anything like that. He's dead, but I was introduced to his writing. If that's the word. He's dead, right? So no one came up to me and said, Brian, I want you to meet my great new friend, Charles Dickens. He's got this great book out, Bleak House. You should check it out. No, I came to his books through another author, talking on the radio about basketball in this way that I'd never heard anybody do before. I was just transfixed, and transported really, on the way that he just lifted this sport I love to the point of poetry. The author was Pat Conroy. He wrote Prince of Tides, Great Santini. Those books were made into movies. And basically all his books, the fiction and the memoirs, they're all basically about his super evil, wicked dad. But I didn't know that while I'm just hearing him talking about jump shots and shit, and how he found his writer's voice in the locker room of his college basketball team while their coach is haranguing them. I didn't memorize the interview or anything like that. I just know that when it was over, I had to get that book that he was talking about. So the interview was over, and I went right to the library. And picked it up. The book was My Losing Season. And sure enough, right on page 81 is the super evil dad. He backhanded me into the passenger side window. His slap had caught me relaxed, and my nose started bleeding profusely. If the blood had not flowed, the beating would have continued. Because I was an expert in translating the fury of my father's eyes, I knew the first backslap was a warm-up for a long night spent warding off his blows. You don't get it, do you, mama's boy? There was nothing my father could not teach me about the architecture of despair. I knew all its shapes and its blueprints, the shadows of all its columns and archways. My father could send me reeling down its hallways and screaming into its bat-spliced attics with a curl of his thin-lipped mouth. Just paint something that's so cruel, so beautifully. Can you do that? But that's not the only part of the book. I mean, there are the basketball sections. In the second, third, and fourth quarters of the game against Asheville Catholic, something happened that had never occurred to me before in sport. I lost all sense of myself in the great tidal movements of the game itself, in the thrusts and retreats and the surges and the falling back of the game. The two teams rapturously engaged in a sublime submission. I began taking long shots on the wing, and I arched them high in the air, and they came down without much backspin. The shots were without artfulness or beauty or much hope behind them. So high did I arch them that they hung in the air for a long segment of time and then fell like fruit from the sky. They swished through the basket with a sound of torn fabric. I hit 3 in a row towards the end of the second quarter. In the fourth quarter, I hit another 3, and my game had shifted into a high plane where it had never gone before. Try missing the Warriors playoffs. This is what you miss. But, any story of substance gets to the big picture, and he starts right off near the beginning. I cannot explain what the sport of basketball meant to me. Me neither. But I've missed it more than anything else in my life since it issued me my walking papers and released me to live out my life as a voyeur and a fan. I was never a very good player, but the sport allowed me glimpses into the kind of man I was capable of becoming. When I found myself driving the lane beneath the hot lights amid the pure electric boisterousness of crowds humming and screaming as a backdrop to my passion, my chosen game, this love of my life, I was the happiest boy who ever lived. I was too. And somewhere in here, I don't remember where exactly, he mentions that in high school, he met a lot of Charles Dickens. I hadn't been forced to read Dickens in school and hadn't yet come to him on my own time. I just knew that if the guy who wrote like that was into Charles Dickens, I was going to check it out. So I went back to the library, tossed My Losing Season into the chute, and I went to the Dickens section. There's about 3 or 4 shelves, if you haven't been there. And I'm just scoping it out, and my eyes are darting over all the different titles, and I don't know, David Copperfield, I've heard of that. I grabbed it, opened it up. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born, as I've been informed and believed, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. It was remarked that the clock began to strike, and I began to cry simultaneously. And I kept reading for weeks, months maybe, however long it took to get through the 850 odd pages in this. But the last word I really understood at all was simultaneously, things happening all at the same time. The rest of it was, my eyes were going across the pages and I could see all the words and I recognized all the punctuation. But, honestly, it was like reading French, which I don't understand. Or maybe more it was like this. It was like Robinson Crusoe alone on an island, stabbing his machete through the bushes till he hopefully gets to some food. I just kept at it, and when I reached the final word, ending with a period, I just chalked it off to experience. Was glad to have gotten through it. I went back to the library. Tossed it into the return chute, and I went on living. I got another book out. I was working in the preschools a lot at the time. I was watching a lot of theater, still doing that. And I was learning new things, making new friends. Do you ever know somebody, maybe they're a good friend or someone you just know peripherally, but somebody whose sole job it is to tell you exactly how you need to live your life? Or maybe it's just a single idea that they know is going to solve some particular problem. Yeah, I had one too. The thing about Priscilla was, though, not you, the thing about Priscilla is that she was right about everything that she told me. I was working at the preschools at UC Berkeley, and so I had full use of the university library and the gym and the pool. So I was swimming almost every day, and when I got done, I would get cleaned up in the locker room and then walk through this hallway that opens up into a snack bar. And I'd get a Cliff Bar or something that had some kind of odd price. So every time we went through this little ritual, and then Priscilla would give me some odd bit of change. And after a couple of weeks of this, out of nowhere, really, she just started telling me what I should read. And I don't know what came over me. I would just do it. She would tell me what to read, and I would go get the book and finish it. And more often than not, I'd read a second and maybe a third or fourth. I'd just become this evangelist, this zealot for whatever author that she would point me to. And I was way, way more into it than she ever was when she was telling me about it. One time, though, I didn't follow her instructions precisely. What she told me to read was Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, this young adult novel from the early 1900s. And I didn't retrieve the book right away, but when I did go to the library, I sat down at the computer catalog, and instead of typing in the title, I typed in the author's name, Kate Douglas Wiggin. And I'm scrolling down, and I see that she wrote an autobiography. I felt a little tug, a little nudge. So I click on the little request icon, and It wasn't at the local Berkeley branch. It was at some library in Los Angeles. So it was going to be a couple of weeks before I was going to get the book. A couple of weeks later, I get the email notice. It's there. I can come pick it up. So I return to the library. And I eagerly trot up to the circulation desk. And they hand me the book. And before I even picked it up, or just afterwards, I was already a happy camper. I mean, the cover is just nice and solid in your hands. It adds some weight to it. It's very just nice and solid. It's got this texture. It feels really good to your fingertips. And the pages are yellowed with age, but not brittle. And then when I did open it up, though, the writing, it's, I guess, what it must be like when you're like knitting a cap for a baby or something. It just kind of gracefully winds in and out of itself in this kind of steady but beautiful way. And she tells about, I'm an educator. She opened some of the first preschools in the U.S. And when she was 10 years old, she met Charles Dickens for real on a train. And she's got this whole chapter about it. But first, she talks about what books meant to her family, because they lived in this rural part of the East Coast. And so she and her siblings didn't have very many playmates. And so their best friends were books. And she says, oh, the unconscious misery, the dullness, the loneliness of the child who does not care for reading. No one pretends that a book is the only open sesame to knowledge, for we learn 1,000 things by other means, by first-hand observation, by the cares and responsibilities of existence, through skill and handicraft, through creative work of any sort. But the book, the dear, enlivening, enchanting, stimulating, informing, uplifting book, is the most faithful of all allies, and after human friendship, the chief solace, as well as the most inspiring influence in human life. And then she starts talking about these bookshelves that were hanging from the ceiling. There were 2 of them, and one of them had all this medical journals and scientific stuff that her dad really liked. And the other shelf was the one that she loved the most. On the 2 lower shelves were most of the novels of Charles Dickens, more eagerly devoured than all the rest, although no book in the case had escaped a second reading. And then when she was just overcome with excitement about needing to choose something next, but she couldn't do it because she'd already read all the other books twice, she would mutter to herself, I'll read David Copperfield over again. It was last week that I finished it for the 4th time. Remember Robinson Crusoe? She was 10 years old. It seems to me that no child nowadays has time to love an author as the children and young people of that generation loved Dickens. Nor do I think that any living author today provokes love in exactly the same fashion. We'll come back to that. From our yellow dog, Pip, to the cat, the canary, the lamb, the cow, down to all the hens and cocks, almost every living thing was named sooner or later after one of Dickens' characters. We never read newspapers, save the weekly Portland Transcript, so that there was a moment of thrilling excitement when my mother, looking up from the Portland Press, told us that Mr. Dickens was coming to America and that he was even then sailing from England. I remember distinctly that I prayed for him fervently several times during the next week, that the voyage might be a safe one and that even the pangs of seasickness might be spared so precious a personage. In due time, we heard that he'd arrived in New York and had begun the series of readings from his books. Then he came to Boston, which was still near, and then, day of unspeakable excitement, we learned that he'd been prevailed upon to give one reading in Portland, Maine, which was only 16 miles away from our village. And it turns out that her mother had previously planned a trip to go visit an uncle of theirs further on in the next town. And when the reading was scheduled, she had a cousin, and she was going to take Kate with her, not the little sister, was going to take Kate with her to that town, and she was not going to go to the reading, but could accompany the grown-ups on the rest of the trip until they got to the uncle's place. These days, charged with suppressed excitement, flew by. I bade goodbye to my little sister, who was not to share my metropolitan experiences, and my mother and I embarked for Portland on the daily train that dashed hither and thither at the rate of about 12 miles an hour. It was 1858. When the August night and a moment arrived, my mother and her cousin set out for the place. And the moment they were out of sight, I slipped out of the door and followed them, traversing quickly the 3 or 4 blocks that separated me from the old city hall and the Preble house where Dickens was stopping. I gazed at all the windows and all the entrances of both buildings without beholding any trace of my hero. I watched the throng of happy, excited, lucky people crowding the streets on their way to the hall and went home in a chastened mood to bed. Not only had my idol provided me with human friends to love and laugh and weep over, but he brought his genius into things, so that, waking or sleeping, every bunch of holly or mistletoe, every plum pudding was alive. Every crush breathed, every that on your way to bed. The next day, though, they all got to go on the train together on the way to the uncle's house. And she spotted him. I was not at any age a person to sit still in her seat when others were looking out of windows, and my small nose was quickly flattened against one of the panes. There on the platform stood the adored one. It was unbelievable, but there he was in the flesh, standing, smiling, breathing like other ordinary human beings. There was no doubt then that angels and ministers of grace, called authors, had bodies and could not only write David Copperfield's, but could be seen with the naked eye.
Wow.
Dickens' hands were plunged deep in his pockets, but presently one was removed to wave away laughingly a piece of famous Berwick sponge cake offered him by Mr. Osgood of Boston, his traveling companion and friend. I knew him at once. The smiling, genial, noble face, rather highly colored, the brilliant eyes, the watch chain, the red carnation in the buttonhole, and the expressive hands, much given to gesture. You know, one guy who went to see a lot of Dickens readings, he said that when he was about to introduce a character, he'd say one word, and then, with some emanation of his being and a single small gesture, would just compel you immediately to have an image of your mind in whatever character he was bringing up next. When my father was again occupied with her book, I slipped away, and borne along by some resistless and hitherto unrecognized force, I entered the next car, which did not seem at all to me a vehicle carrying Tom, Dick, and Harry to Boston, but a sort of traveling shrine or altar. She spotted him again. There's an Indian myth which relates that when the gaze of the Shiva rested for the first time on Teletonea, the most beautiful of women, his desire to see her was so great that his body became all eyes. Such a transformation, I fear, was perilously being to near my fate. Half an hour passed, perhaps, and one gentleman after another came from here or there to exchange a word of greeting with the famous novelist, so that he was never for a moment alone. Suddenly, however, Mr. Osgood arose and, with an apology, went into the smoking car. I never knew how it happened. I had no plan, no preparation, no intention, certainly no provocation, but invisible ropes pulled me out of my seat, and speeding up the aisle, I planted myself breathlessly and timorously down, an unbidden guest in the seat of honor. I had a moment to recover my equanimity, for Dickens was looking out of the window, but he suddenly turned and said with justifiable surprise, "God bless my soul, child! Where did you come from?" My heart was in my mouth, but there was still room to exercise my tongue, which was generally the case. I was frightened, but not so completely frightened as if I had been meeting a stranger. You see, I knew him, even if he did not know me. So I became immediately autobiographical, although palpitating with nervousness. I had to tell him, I thought, where I came from, who I was, where I was going, or how I could account for myself and my presence beside him in Mr. Osgood's seat. So I began, stammeringly, to answer his question. I came from Hollis, Maine, and I'm going to Charleston to visit my uncle. My mother and her cousin went to your reading last night, but of course 3 couldn't go from the same family. It was too expensive. So I stayed at home. And Nora, that's my little sister, is left behind in Hollis. She's too small to go on a journey, but she wanted to go to the reading dreadfully. There was a lady there who had never heard of Betsy Trotwood, from David Copperfield, and had only read 2 of your books. Well, upon my word, you do not mean to say that you have read them? Of course, every one of them, but the 2 we're going to buy in Boston, and some of them 6 times. Bless my soul, those long, thick books! And you, such a slip of a thing? Of course, I do skip some of the very dull parts once in a while. Not the short, dull parts, but the long ones. Now that is something that I hear very little about. I distinctly want to learn more about those very long, dull parts. And whether to amuse himself or to amuse me, I don't know. He took out a notebook and pencil from his pocket and proceeded to give me an exhaustive examination on the subject. The books in which the dull parts predominated and the characters and subjects which principally produced them. He chuckled so constantly during this operation that I could hardly help believing myself extraordinarily agreeable. So I continued dealing these infant blows, under the delusion that I was flinging him bouquets. It was not long before one of my hands was in his, and his arm around my waist, while we talked of many things. They say that his hands were undistinguished, and that he wore too many rings. Well, those criticisms must come from persons who never felt the warmth of his handclasp. For my part, I'm glad that Pullman chair cars had not come into fashion, else I should never have experienced the delicious joy of snuggling up to genius and of being distinctly encouraged in the attitude. I remember feeling that I'd never known anybody so well and so intimately, and that I talked with him as one talks under the cover of darkness or before the flickering light of a fire. All the details of the meeting stand out as clearly as though it had happened yesterday. I can see every article of his clothing and of my own, the other passengers in the car, the landscape through the window, and above all, the face of Dickens, deeply lined with sparkling eyes and an amused, waggish smile that curled the corners of his mouth under his grizzled mustache. "What book of mine do you like best?" Dickens asked. "Oh, I like David Copperfield much the best. That's the one I've read 6 times. 6 times? Good God! I'm glad that you like Davy. So do I. I like it best too, clapping his hands. I never had looked behind to see how my mother was faring. There are great crises in life when even mothers must retire to the background. For the moment, I had no mother, family, friends, or acquaintances. No home, no personality. I was a sort of atom floating in space, half conscious that I could not float forever, but must come to earth again. I almost set great expectations. We named our little yellow dog Mr. Pip out of your book. Here again, my new friend's mirth was delightful to behold. So much so that my embarrassed mother, who had been watching me for half an hour, almost made up her mind to drag me away before the very eyes of our fellow passengers. We had a mother, a big curly one. Did you want to go to my reading very much, child? Was another question. Yes, I did, more than tongue could tell. I know how I feel when I read one of the books. I wanted to hear how it sounded. I looked up a second later when I was sure that the tears in my eyes were not going to fall. And to my astonishment, saw that Dickens' eyes were in precisely the same state of moisture. It was a never-to-be-forgotten moment, although I was too young to appreciate the full significance. Do you cry when you read aloud too? I asked. We all do in our family, and we never read about Tiny Tim or about Steerforth when his body is washed up on the beach on Saturday nights, for fear our eyes will be too swollen to go to Sunday school. Yes, I cry when I read about Steerforth. I cried when I wrote it, too. That's still the more foolish. Where do you cry the worst? Our time is when it says, all the men who carried him had known him and gone sailing with him and seen him merry and bold. You're not traveling alone. Oh, my goodness. Certainly not. I had a mother, but I forgot all about her. Dickens took me back to the forgotten mother and introduced himself, and I, still clinging to his hand, left the car and walked with him down the platform until he disappeared in the carriage with Mr. Osgood, leaving me with the feeling that I must continue my existence somehow in a dull and dreary world. That was my last glimpse of him, but pictures made in childhood are painted in bright hues, and this one has never faded. The child of today would hardly be able to establish so instantaneous a friendship. She would have heard of celebrity hunters and autograph collectors and be self-conscious, while I followed the dictates of my countrified little heart and scraped acquaintance confidently with the magician who had glorified my childhood by his art. As I'm writing, there comes into print an autographed letter of Robert Louis Stevenson. I wonder if you've ever read Dickens' Christmas books. I've read only 2 of them yet, and I've cried my eyes out and have a terrible time not to sob. But oh dear God, I feel so good after them, and would do anything to make the world better for people. I wish I could lose no time. I want to go out and comfort someone. I shall never listen to the nonsense they tell me about not giving money. I shall give money. Not that I haven't done so always, but I shall do it with a high hand now. Oh, what a jolly thing it is for a man to have written books like these books and just filled people's hearts with a desire to do good. Who wouldn't want to meet that guy, at least out of curiosity? I just was panting with bated breath, and so I got about as far as halfway through the autobiography, and then I had to take it back to the library. Tossed it in the chute, and returned to the Dickens section. But this time, with a new resolve. With that kind of feeling, when you want to do something over again, but do it better this time. Whether it's a relationship, a handicraft, or maybe it's some kind of character skill. You just want to be a better person. And so my eyes still darted across all the different titles, but this time a thought came to me, and it was as if the jet fuel from one of the Apollo spacecraft was under me. The idea was this, that I was going to find a Dickens book, but one that I could not only understand the first sentence, but the first page. And so, I took one down. Semicolon, semicolon, comma, semicolon. Okay, we'll put this back. What is he talking about? I was Robinson Crusoe again. But there was the jet fuel under me. But I found one. It took 7 or 8 tries. The Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. You've never heard of it, but you can tell it's him right from the title. I opened it up. As no lady or gentleman with any claims to polite breeding can possibly sympathize with the Chuzzlewit family without being first assured of the extreme antiquity of the race, comma, it's a great satisfaction to know that it undoubtedly descended in a direct line from Adam and Eve, semicolon, and was, in the very earliest times, closely connected with the agricultural interests. If it should ever be surged by grudging and malicious persons that a Chuzzlewit, in any period of the family history, displayed an overweening amount of family pride, surely the weakness will be considered not only pardonable, but laudable, comma, when the immense superiority of the house to the rest of mankind, in respect of its ancient origin, is taken into account. I was getting it. I even laughed. It was getting dark out, though, and it was almost time for the library to close. And so I kind of waddled out from between the stacks of the library. I felt like I was in a monastery in the 1200s and I had found the Holy Grail. I came out from between the stacks and unconsciously got to the checkout machine and slid the book under, beep, and walked outside and continued reading up the steps and down the sidewalk. It was safe, though. I have a license to read and walk down the sidewalk at the same time. I continued, and I thrilled at the understanding. And I had some evening errands to do, so I took the book home, tossed it on my bed, went out and took care of business, and came back when something extraordinary happened. Every other book that I had read, every great one, really, was great, but only in a particular way. You know, maybe it's got a suspenseful plot, so you just can't wait to turn to the next page, or it's got brilliant dialogue. The author has a terrific ear, and so you know that he's just got it exactly the way those people talk. Or maybe it's a scene description. It might be just of a lake or something, but you can see it, and it feels holy to picture it in your mind. But this guy, he did everything. Now, my preference, or prejudice really, to that point was that I just love that kind of hidden power that comes when words are put in a particular order, and it just makes your heart pound. It tells you, this is beautiful. This is very, very good. More so than the order of events. But then I came to a scene where he's describing a road. And on that road is an office. And inside that office are 2 greedy lawyers talking. And they're talking in an office, which is in a town, which he talks about. And normally, at that point, I'd be finished. I would chalk it off to good writing. I was never one of those people that, oh, I can see it in my mind's eye. Oh, no, I would just push on or put the book away altogether. But after that scene in the town, I came to another one. As this fair matron sat beside the fire, she glanced occasionally with all the pride of ownership about the room, a physical space. Now, normally that would be the cue for me to check out and put the book away or just push on, especially in school. But, inspired by that office and the two people in it, she glanced occasionally with all the pride of ownership about the room, which was a large apartment, such as one may see in country places, with a low roof and a sunken flooring. And right here now, it would have been Robinson Crusoe time, and just a haze, and maybe it was good, but I just can't take this. But it was as if Dickens himself reached out and grabbed me by the hand, and he said, "Oh no, stop! Go back!" And I tried. About the room, which was a large apartment, such a one as might be seen in country places, with a low roof. And I kept reading over and over until I could see a roof, and it got lower until it got to low, whatever that was, and a sunken flooring. And the floor was straight until over and over again I could see it just dipping. And a descent of 2 steps on the inside, so exquisitely unexpected that strangers, despite the most elaborate cautioning, usually dived in head first, as into a plunging bath. And over again I read until I could see it. I could see the people falling and tripping, and I could see him seeing them with a smile on his face. And this thought came to me. It was very quiet, and it was like a voice. Very quiet, though, but no less powerful. And this was it. I'm going to milk this guy.
So the king himself gave his land to the church, and this was, the argument needed in the Catholic Church. And then they built what are the sisters in the presentation, built this whole elaborate schoolyard, and they sold some of that to the university. and they put up some townhouses. It was great. The alumni came back recently, and we got to talk to them about the way things were, how they. Yeah, he's one of our first. It's great. It's affordable. We were not sure how we were going to be able to raise Emma up. Well, by law, yes. But it's too much. We went from a place where the counter was like so. The counter for preparing food was like this in our old place, and now it's really makes it so much easier to feed the child. I saw a friend today, and he and his husband adopted 4 boys. This was all they're like a completely rock solid family now. Yeah. Well, the boys are growing up, and they're all teenagers now. Since they buy 9 gallons of milk a week. 9 gallons of milk for 4 boys, 4 teenage boys now. And he said they looked into whether or not it would be better to buy a cow.
Yeah.
That's good.
Not extraneous things like novels. Not so much.
Hey there.
You know how musicians are always talking about those riffs and licks that they learn? Guitar players talk a lot about this. You know, those patterns of notes and melodies that they practice over and over again while they're developing their repertoire, their own songs and other people's. And if you listen to 2 different songs, you know, a couple different songs, and maybe you're listening to one of them, and you get that feeling sometimes, like, I've heard this before. And then, if the song's any good, at a certain point it diverges off into its own unique character. You know, authors do the same thing. Here's Elie Wiesel remembering what it was like in Nazi death camps. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp. It turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. In this bit of fiction, if you've never spent whole afternoons with burning ears and rumpled hair, forgetting the world around you over a book, forgetting cold and hunger if you've never read secretly under the bedclothes with a flashlight because your father or mother or some other well-meaning person has switched off the lamp on the plausible ground that it was time to sleep because you had to get up so early. If you've never wept bitter tears because a wonderful story has come to an end and you must take your leave of the characters with whom you've shared so many adventures, whom you have loved and admired, for whom you have hoped and feared, and without whose company life seems empty and meaningless. If such things have never been a part of your own experience, you probably won't understand what Bastian did next. I didn't used to notice things like that. Not consciously, anyway. Until this moment over the phone with my friend Julie. She teaches writing. And there was this month or two where both of us were in between jobs. And at night, over the phone, we'd read out loud from our favorite passages, or whatever we were reading at the time. And one night, Julie was taking her turn from something that went on for a while. And it was just so touching that when she finished, there really wasn't anything for us to do except kind of melt into the quiet. And in that silence, it was as if this column of lava was kind of easing its way to the top. It had been doing that since, 7th grade, but now, during this silence, it was getting to the top, and it came out the mouth and spilled over, and then the volcano erupted, and I shouted at Julie over the phone, and I said, Julie, why is it that why do teachers all over the country and all over the world, why do they demand that we explain to them what apples mean?
What apples mean? I'm listening.
She said, I don't know. I never asked the question. Well, of course she didn't. I mean, she's no ivory tower dope. Like, she reads for real, and she's a really nice person. But, I just continued on in this painful harangue about why is it, and I just recounted being asked to explain what some theme was, or what an apple meant, or what was the name of this pattern of words or sentences in a book. And I said, did you ever think about this stuff? Symbols and themes or whatever. She said, oh yeah, since I was about 4. Well, I know that when somebody asked Einstein, how long have you been wondering what happens when a train is going down the tracks at the speed of light squared and a little boy is running up beside it at the speed of light? What does that mean for space travel? I know he gave the same answer. So I asked her, well, what did you ask your non-genius students? Just give me an assignment. I was about to start a new book. Just tell me, what do you ask them to do? And I don't know the whole details of what it was she asked me to do, but this one bit, she said, just write down what you notice. Whatever you notice. You mean I didn't have to make note of what time little Tony got to the corner store and picked out his lollipop off the shelf? Just whatever I noticed. And, it sounds like maybe a timid phrase and a easy instruction. But, when you're reading something and you just make note of what you notice, it was like, you know what it's like when you're on the beach and this cold wind is whipping back and forth and it's really cold and you want to go in the water and you're afraid that when you put your foot in, it'll be cold too, but you're pleasantly surprised that it's a little bit warm. And so you put your whole foot in and you start walking. And the next thing you know, the ocean is up at your waist. And then these waves are just crashing all over you. These waves of feeling were just crashing all over me, just at a feverish pitch as I just made notes of what I happened to notice. And it wasn't really quite overwhelming because I was prepared for it. Mr. Adele was my junior year high school teacher for English. And one day, we were all doing some in-class assignment, and he was grading something at his desk, some longer homework that we'd done a couple of weeks before. And just like Wiggin, I don't know how I got there. Just somehow I was standing in front of his desk, and somehow this question just came out of me. And I said, Mr. Adele, why is it that the best books are always so hard to understand? And it just seems so, it was almost like he was expecting the question. And he was doing the grading, and he just looked up and started walking to the front of the classroom until we got to the blackboard. And he picked up a piece of chalk. He didn't say anything. And he just drew this line about 4 feet across and put a little hash mark on one side and a hash mark on the other side. And then he wrote a couple words. On one side, he wrote chaos. And then on the other side, he wrote order. And he said, the best books, they're trying to make this much order out of this much chaos. It was one of those answers that parents must have to give their children a lot. They're having a really, really tough time and they're asking some big question, and you have to tell them something. And, it doesn't answer everything and it doesn't stop their tears necessarily, but it makes them feel like the world is just not going to crash around them, and, maybe grown-ups have something worth listening to some of the time. It was like that. I could go on until I met this guy with all the semicolons and everything else and the 2-inch fat. I ended up spending, when I got done with the Chuzzlewit book, I ended up spending 2.5 years plodding away through every one of his 15 fat books. And then I take a little rest in between, reading shorter children's books. And it was a bittersweet time. When I finished it, I just moved to the north side of Richmond, and I was taking classes in early childhood development, getting a degree in that, and working at the College of Alameda Preschool. And it took 3 buses to get there. And I was really looking forward to the classes and the work, but I had a couple of things that were sort of heart-wrenching below that. I was like crazily in love with this good friend of mine who was already married. And also, just kind of underneath the whole school and work thing, I had just always been a little bit more passive than I wanted to. I'd just never really quite been in charge of everything. And reading these books, it did two things. One of them was it gave me a job. You know, while I was waiting for the bus, it was my job to ponder over that paragraph until I could see it. And it helped me remember all kinds of things. It helped me follow instructions. It helped me think clearly. And you know how it is when you're like going through just a really rough patch, really, really painful, and you have those same heartaches over and over again? He does it the same way in his books, over and over again, but just slightly different. And so it was like that Roberta Flack song. The singer-songwriter who went to go hear Don McLean, who wrote American Pie, and Vincent, that song about Van Gogh, and she was so touched by how he sang that she had to write her own song about what it was like going to the concert. And there's this verse at the end of it. He sang as if he knew me in all my dark despair. And then he looked right through me as if I wasn't there. And he just kept on singing, singing clear and strong, strumming my pain with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his song, killing me softly with his song, telling my whole life with his words, killing me softly with his song. And I'd get on the second bus, and I'd have that song just rummaging through my mind while I was reading. Yeah, that's what it feels like. And then this verse came to me that is a little bit more specific to the case. How does he know what I'm feeling? Why does he know what I think? How does he say what I would say if I could say it in my dreams? If I could say it in my dreams, cold and lonely, though they are. We were talking earlier about riffs and licks. Dickens himself starts this one chapter, and it's this town. Let us strike the keynote before pursuing our tune. And then he starts playing. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted faces of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye and vast piles of building full of windows where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who went all in and out at the same hours and with the same sound upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. You know, like in that song, he just speaks to the deepest part of whatever you might be feeling. And I mean, whatever. I mean, did you know that Charles Dickens went to the DMV? He did. And he also was at the immigration office. I mean, we've been fighting a lot about this lately, right? Some people are like, gotta keep those people out. Some people are themselves trying to get in. And other people are frantically making phone calls, trying to keep track of these children and get them hooked back up with their parents so they can go to whatever country they want to be in. But all of us have this feeling like there's some inexorable force that is just keeping us from doing what it is that we know to be right, and we want more than anything to set forth and to do. And it's stopping us. And that force, it has a name. And it was very active in the time of Dickens, and he wrote about it. The Circumlocution Office was, as everybody knows without being told, the most important department under government. No public business of any kind could possibly be done at any time without the acquiescence of the Circumlocution Office. Its finger was in the largest public pie and in the smallest public tot. It was equally impossible to do the plainest right and to undo the plainest wrong without the express authority of the Circumlocution Office. You've been there, right? If another gunpowder plot had been discovered half an hour before the lighting of the match, nobody would have been justified in saying the Parliament, in saving the Parliament, until there had been half a score of boards, half a bushel of minutes, several sacks of official memoranda, and a family vault full of ungrammatical correspondence on the part of the Circumlocution Office. Now, I'm going to have to stop right here because I'm in a really quandary. I mean, this is actually my favorite part of the show, and I want to go on, but we were in rehearsal a couple of weeks ago, and a dear friend who couldn't make it tonight, she's got her own show. She loved the first act, but when she got to this part, well, let me just say that I'm not really sure what to do except for us to just take on the title of this show, and we're going to interrogate a long sentence, or a long passage anyway. So we're going to go on for just a little while longer, at which you're going to find out something crucial about the Circumlocution Office. And if at that point, it'll be just a little while, if at that point you are wanting to bolt for the door or get out your phone, or just, blow out into smoke or whatever, then I want to hear your unabashed disapproval. And I want to hear hisses and boos as loud as they possibly can. But if you want to hear more about exactly how the Circumlocution Office works, and it speaks to your heart and you have a sense of fellow feeling about it, I want to hear also, unabashedly, cheers and clapping, just as, that's going to raise the roof in here. Don't be shy. And after that, why, we'll decide what to do next. But here's our chance to interrogate. So here's just a little while longer. And this glorious establishment had been early in the field when the one sublime principle involving the difficult art of governing a country was first distinctly revealed to statesmen and the rest of us. It had been foremost to study the bright revelation and to carry its shining influence through the whole of the official proceedings. Whatever was required to be done, the Circumlocution Office was beforehand with all the public departments in the art of perceiving how not to do it. All right, those of you who want to know more about how not to do it, or those people who can't stand it and want to bolt from the door, and this is the longest passage that you can possibly stand, please, let's hear your unabashed disapproval, if there is any. All right, those of you who want to hear more about how exactly the Circumlocution Office works, maybe it'll help you deal with it more effectively, or at least it'll speak to your heart, and you'll feel a sense of comfort that you're not alone, that someone knows how it works, that they know what you're going through. All right. It's true that how not to do it was the great study and object of all public departments and professional politicians all round the Circumlocution Office. It's true that every new premier and every new government coming in, because they had upheld a certain thing as necessary to be done, were no sooner come in than they applied their utmost faculties to discovering how not to do it. It's true that from the moment when a general election was over, every returned man who had been raving on hustings because it hadn't been done, and who had been asking for the friends of the honorable gentleman in the opposite interest on pain of impeachment to tell him why it hadn't been done, and who had been asserting that it must be done, and who had been pledging himself that it should be done, began to devise how it was not to be done. It's true that the debates of both houses of Parliament, the whole session through, uniformly tended to the protracted deliberation how not to do it. It's true that the royal speech at the opening of such session virtually said, "My lords and gentlemen, you have a considerable stroke of work to do, and will you please to retire to your respective chambers and discuss how not to do it." It's true that the royal speech at the close of such session virtually said, "My lords and gentlemen, you have been through several laborious months, considering with great loyalty and patriotism how not to do it. And you have found out. And with the blessing of Providence upon the harvest, I now dismiss you. All this is true. All this is true. But the Circumlocution Office went beyond it. Because the Circumlocution Office went on mechanically, every day, keeping this wonderful, all-sufficient wheel of statesmanship, how not to do it, in motion. Because the Circumlocution Office was down upon any ill-advised public servant who was going to do it, or who appeared to be by any surprising accident in remote danger of doing it, with a minute and a memorandum and a letter of instructions that extinguished him. It was this spirit of national efficiency in the Circumlocution Office that had gradually led to its having something to do with everything. Mechanicians, natural philosophers, soldiers, sailors, petitioners, memorialists, people with grievances, people who wanted to prevent grievances, people who wanted to redress grievances, jobbing people, jobbed people, people who couldn't get rewarded for merit, people who couldn't get punished for demerit, were all indiscriminately tucked up under the foolscap paper of the Circumlocution Office. And sometimes angry spirits attacked the Circumlocution Office. Sometimes parliamentary questions were asked about it, and even parliamentary motions made or threatened about it by demagogues so low and ignorant as to hold that the real recipe of government was how to do it. Then, with a noble lord or right honorable gentleman in whose department it was to defend the Circumlocution Office, put an orange in his pocket, and made a regular field day of the occasion. Then would he come down to that house with a slap upon the table, and meet the honorable gentleman foot to foot. Then would he be there to tell that honorable gentleman that the Circumlocution Office not only was blameless in this matter, but was commendable in this matter, was extollable to the skies in this matter. Then would he be there to tell the honorable gentleman that although the Circumlocution Office was invariably right and wholly right, it never was so right as in this matter. Then would he be there to tell that honorable gentleman that it would have been more to his honor, more to his credit, more to his good taste, more to his good sense, more to half the dictionary of commonplaces if he had left the Circumlocution Office alone and never approached this matter. Then would he keep one eye upon a coach or crammer from the Circumlocution Office sitting below the bar and smash the honorable gentleman with the Circumlocution Office account of this matter. And although one of two things always happened, namely, either that the Circumlocution Office had nothing to say, and said it, or that it had something to say of which the noble lord or right honorable gentleman blundered one half and forgot the other. The Circumlocution Office was always voted immaculate by an accommodating majority. I have a confession to make. I knew it was going to come up sometime tonight, and I guess now is. This is really embarrassing. I was a short sentence Nazi. I was. From the time I was 5 years old, if I encountered more words than 5 at a time in a book, in a conversation, I just would feel like it must be stopped on pain of death. Anything longer than 5 sentences was like a form letter. You know what that's like. The terms of service on some internet website, or the long explanation on your phone bill. I felt like it was that, intended to deceive, intended to confuse, to steal you of money or get you to go down the wrong way. That's what long sentences were for. But I did, just like Mr. Adele prepared me for Julie and the volcano and the ocean. Kurt Vonnegut, who was just really a comfort during that Nazi period of mine. I mean, I would wonder, why would you open a book like the Chuzzlewit book when you could just start the way that Kurt Vonnegut opened his wonderful novel Slapstick? You know how it starts? This is the closest thing I have ever written to an autobiography. Period. And I read everything that he had written at the time when I was introduced to him, and then read them again. And after he wrote his last book, but before he died, I wrote him a thank you letter. And he wrote back. But it was on the paper that looked like the type that you get from your phone company bill, or the typeface that it would be on those terms of service. But this is how it started. It pains me. It pains me to have to write anything that is remotely like a form letter. But I've gotten such response to my latest book that I just cannot write to each of you individually. And so, and then he goes on about how beautiful it is to walk to the post office box and drop things in. It was the most beautiful thing. It was the form letter written just for you. And I don't know, maybe, I mean, I've never had to write a form letter before. Maybe it's hard. Just stop when you're finished. Maybe you just kind of have to get on until you fill out all those details. I used to feel like going on at any length past 5 words was a moral defect. Something to be, cut off at the nose. But then I met Shirley, who was in charge of a workshop, a job finding workshop. And at lunch, went on for 2 weeks. And at the lunch of one of the days, she invited me to join her at a restaurant that was just a couple of storefronts down. And it was an hour lunch, and we had what I would call a versation. I mean, we were both there, but I was doing all the talking. And she looked at her watch, and that reminded me it was time for us to go back and her to do her work. She was one of the facilitators. And it just came out, like Wiggin, like to Mr. Adele. It just came out. I don't know where all that came from. And she said, "You had a lot to say." And so did he. How does it feel when you have all that in there? Just listen. When you're walking down the street and you hear the people chattering on the sidewalk, and you can see them chattering in a cafe, or maybe you're in the middle of it. If you were to make them stop, and when you're reading, you only want them to just capture that part? Or do you want them to get it all? And tell you all of it. So that you know that he's seen what you've seen and heard what you've heard. He's been there. She's been there. Right along with you. Just end it there.
Drumming my baby's feet. I heard it sang a good song. I heard it had see you listen for a while. And there he was, this young boy, a stranger to my eyes.